This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 523 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, baseball fans, FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to get involved with daily fantasy baseball with the MLB Home Run Challenge. Each day you can draft 3 players, and you'll receive 1 point for every home run they hit. Score 3 points for a share of the $2,000 prize pool, or score 6 or more points, and you'll win a share of the $10,000 prize pool. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and draft your sluggers. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Okay, mailbag episode, let's do it. The first question this week is from @FFHansonator. Hey JJ, love the pod, by the way. Thanks. How does team level regression apply for new coaching staffs and or quarterbacks for teams? For example, New York and Jacksonville with coaching, and Wilson/Lawrence, and Carolina with Darnold. Always appreciate your data-driven insights. Yeah, so like I said on the show earlier this week, when you have a ton of things changing in an offense, regression is less relevant. For a lot of reasons. The main one being what regression actually is. Like when we talk regression, we're saying if everything stays the same and skill levels don't change, these numbers are going to change. It's just that when you get certain seasons from players that are unsustainable in either direction, fantasy managers are going to be inclined to use numbers from that previous season to make judgment calls on the current season, especially if situations haven't changed all that much. But when situations change dramatically, yeah, regression and the math behind regression, that becomes less relevant. I think what's important to note is that if you're making projections or if you're forecasting a player's outlook, that you should recognize that there are a lot of statistics in football that regress to the mean. Most statistics regress to the mean. People then make these assumptions about a team or a player that these statistics are their new norm, but that's usually not the case. And that's really what the last couple of weeks shows we're all about. The next question is related to that first one. It's from @LukeAngelica1. It says, hi JJ, love the pod. Thanks. You talked about all kinds of regression the past 2 weeks, but which kinds do you weigh more into your projections? Like touchdown regression or pass to rush attempt regression? Thanks. So the answer to this is all of the above. Projections naturally weed out regression. When I project pass to rush ratio, I have a formula that does it for me. And it's based on neutral script ratio the previous season, coordinator tendencies, win projections, and then I add some subjectivity to some teams if things just objectively look a little wonky. But because those formulas exist, regression naturally occurs. Like if a team had a pass to rush ratio of 2 one year, meaning they threw the ball twice as much as they ran it, then their projection wouldn't come out as 2 the following year. It'd naturally be lower. And then the same goes for touchdowns. The formula that I use to get a baseline team touchdown projection just naturally shows regression. So you may be wondering, why should we care about regression then? Well, the reason is because the majority of fantasy managers aren't creating projections. And I wouldn't expect them to. So like I said in the previous question, since managers are using numbers from previous seasons, and since you can recognize those numbers aren't sustainable, then you're at an advantage, you're gaining an edge. So hopefully that makes sense. Regression really is kind of irrelevant when you're building projections, because those projections sort of automatically show that regression. This next question is from @ChristianPendy9. My PPR league added an extra flex this year, so now we start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and 2 flex. How does this change positional value and draft strategy? Do wide receivers gain value and running backs lose value? Or are the top 15 running backs even more valuable? Do tight ends and quarterbacks lose value? Thanks. I get this type of question all the time. I'm sure I've answered it multiple times on a mailbag episode in the past, but I figured I'd get to it this week. But this comes down to supply and demand. When you change the starting restrictions in your lineup, you're changing the demand for that position. Like if your 12-team league started 8 running backs per team, and then it started just 1 of every other position, then the demand for running backs would increase. More running backs would go early because you need more of them in your starting lineup each week. Now, there's plenty of strategy that comes from that too. If you know where running backs tend to flatten with their projected scoring, you can start to develop strategies on where you should pinpoint your quarterback, wide receiver, or tight end in that kind of format. But there's no doubt that in a format like that, the running back position becomes even more important because you need more of them. With an additional flex, you need more running backs or wide receivers. And since it's a PPR league, you'll likely find that wide receivers in particular get a little bit more love. And in turn, other positions don't see that uptick in demand. This is one of the things that I always find fascinating with the Scott Fish Bowl. For those of you who don't know about the Scott Fish Bowl, it's a giant tournament filled with tons of leagues that have both analysts across the fantasy industry, but they have fans as well. You can read all about it on scottfishbowl.com. I know a lot of you already know about the Scott Fish Bowl. The league structure for the Scott Fish Bowl, or SFB, it features scoring that favors quarterbacks. You can really get destroyed by bad quarterback performances, and it's super flex, so that drives the prices for quarterbacks up as well. But what I feel like goes unnoticed so often in superflex formats is that people then ignore how many flex spots a league might have. Like if you have a standard lineup that just has an additional superflex spot, that's one thing. But with the Scott Fish Bowl, you've got massive rosters and starting lineups. You're starting 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, and a tight end, but there are 4 additional spots that you have to fill. That still changes the supply and demand formula for the other positions. It's not just about the quarterback. Like I'm not saying don't get quarterback early in that kind of format. I'm just saying that it's not an absolute lock to have to do that. And it's because the supply and demand equation not only is shifting for quarterbacks, it is for other positions as well. And it's because of those additional flex spots. This is all to say that it's important to look at the lineup needs for every position instead of being locked into this mindset of, oh man, it's super flex. I've absolutely got to get a quarterback in round 1 instead of Christian McCaffrey. And that goes for something like this. If your league adds a flex, that increases the need for the positions that you can flex. It decreases the need for positions that you can't flex. So in this case, even though it's pretty slight because it's just one flex spot, you can increase the value for wide receivers in particular because it's a PPR format and decrease quarterback. This next question is from @Waynes_rant. Hey JJ, I have the 3rd pick in a 16-man redraft league. I'm assuming Henry and CMC will go 1 and 2. Personally, I'm between Cook and Chubb, considering Barkley has a tough schedule and Kamara's quarterback situation is a disaster. Any insight to who has more upside between Cook and Chubb? Now, I also got a question this week from @news_egg_ that asked, who would you rather have in a half PPR league? T. Higgins, Cam Akers, or DeAndre Swift? Now, I wanted to answer these questions on today's show, not to call out the people who asked them. I appreciate the questions, and I think that they're valid, especially if you haven't been drafting this offseason. But first off, you guys can get my rankings over on numberfire.com this year for absolutely free. Just go to numberfire.com, click NFL at the top, then 2021 NFL Draft Kit, and then Expert Rankings. Those are my rankings for half PPR leagues. But both of these questions can be answered by looking at average draft position. With the first one, even if it's a standard league, I can't imagine taking Nick Chubb over any of those running backs. I love Nick Chubb. I actually think Chubb may be undervalued this year, which is crazy because I'm someone who always gravitates towards running backs who catch a lot of passes. But Chubb doesn't catch a lot of passes, and that's a problem. He's still sharing that backfield with Kareem Hunt. It's tough to buy into that at the 3 spot instead of true workhorses. And ADP really reflects that. And then the same goes for the second question. There's a pretty big gap in ADP between Cam Akers and DeAndre Swift, and then there's a massive gap from there to T. Higgins. I don't always just automatically agree with ADP, not even close. But it's not that common for me to have a take where it would disagree that strongly with what ADP is saying, with what the market is saying, unless I really, really like a certain player. And in this case, I don't really, really love DeAndre Swift to put him ahead of Cam Akers. So if anyone has a question like this one, I'd first check with my rankings, and then I'd double check average draft position as well. And for the record, I try to update my rankings each week. This next question is from @TroyLikesStuff. Where do you see the tier breaks at tight end this year? Seems like tier 1, Kelsey, Waller, Kittle, tier 2, Pitts, Andrews, Hawkinson, and maybe Higbee alone in tier 3. Anyone you would prioritize after these aforementioned gentlemen? Thank you. I think the first 2 tiers are pretty obvious, and I would agree. I have it ranked Kelsey, Waller, Kittle, and then Pitts, Andrews, Hawkinson. And to me, there's a fairly big break after those 2 tiers. But you mentioned Tyler Higbee in this next tier all alone. And I think it's fine if you view things that way. I still have Dallas Goedert over him, and I think you could still consider Logan Thomas in that tier, but I get it. Higbee has an interesting ceiling given what we've seen with him when Gerald Everett's been sidelined. Higbee basically played with an injured Gerald Everett from weeks 13 through 17 in 2019. And in those weeks, he averaged over 21 PPR points per game. He had a weekly target share of over 27%. Last year, Gerald Everett was on the injury report for one game with what I think was a back injury. He played 16 games, but in that one game against Philly where he was on the injury report, he didn't see a single target. He was on the field for about 43% of the team's snaps, but he didn't see a target. I don't think it's just a coincidence that happened the week that he was on the injury report. That game, Tyler Higbee was the tight end 1 in weekly scoring after he found the end zone 3 times on a 19% target share. Now, I think we're working with a small sample here, so I wouldn't get too excited about these splits. But I also don't think it's that big of a deal if you buy into that a little bit. It's not like Higbee has a cost that's so outrageously high to the point where the opportunity cost in getting him is so significant. So if you want Higbee in a tier all alone, I understand it. I really do. I think at least Goddard belongs in there though too. This next question is from @MattyB29664864. Has the Miles Sanders fade gone too far? In most of my drafts, he's going mid to late 4th as the RB19 with an ADP of 39.8. He's still the RB1 in Philly, and we have to expect the team to be better than last season. And even last season, Sanders produced when on the field. The team couldn't have been worse, yet Sanders was still solid. Per Roto Underworld, he was 14th in yards created, 10th in yards created per touch, 11th in true yards per carry. Love the show, thanks. Yeah, I got another question about Miles Sanders this week, so here's my take. I don't think talent is necessarily the problem for Miles Sanders. I've been a big Miles Sanders backer on this show. I was very into him last season, and that looked pretty bad until the end of the year when it mattered most in the fantasy playoffs. But overall, he was a bad pick last year. I do think this idea that Miles Sanders hasn't been a workhorse is absolutely crazy, though. And we see it all the time from fantasy analysts. That Doug Peterson was just refusing to use Miles Sanders as a workhorse. Last year, Sanders was 8th in the NFL in running back rush share per game. It was higher than Ezekiel Elliott's and Josh Jacobs and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and that list goes on and on. Let's chill out with this idea that he wasn't seeing a high percentage of his team's running back rushes. The issue is less about talent for me, and that whole thing with Doug Peterson, because he's no longer there. It's just that we have this new coaching staff, and we don't know how they're going to utilize him. And that coaching staff, whether you're looking at head coach Nick Sirianni or offensive coordinator Shane Steichen, they're two coaches who do have a history of sort of utilizing their running backs in specific roles. We saw that with Sirianni and the Colts, and to some degree, Steichen with the Chargers. That's why there's some hesitation for me. That's why there's some downside, because we don't totally know. And I don't love the fact that they drafted Kenneth Gainwell when I think Gainwell is a very talented back and a good pass-catching back. Now, with that being said, if you're getting Sanders in round 4, I really don't have an issue with that. He has a 3-down workhorse skill set. And like I said and like the data says, he's a good running back. Unfortunately, the running back position can often come down to coaching decisions. And in this case, that's a giant X factor, which is why he's going where he's going. So he's not someone I'm actively targeting, but I'm more in on Sanders than I'm out. This next question is from @SuaveSwaverson. How are you projecting the target distribution in Jacksonville? It feels like any combination of Jones, Shenault, or Chark could lead the team in targets. What are the odds Lawrence in his rookie year could produce 2 consistent fantasy viable assets? So the odds are low that Trevor Lawrence ends up supporting multiple pass catchers who are really relevant in fantasy. I did an entire episode on that a few weeks ago, episode 518. That means we have to try to pick who that one wide receiver might be. I don't mind throwing darts at any of them, but I'd probably lean Shenault over Jones and Chark because I don't think we've seen what Chenault's capable of. There was a good tweet from my friend Hayden Winks, or @HaydenWinks on Twitter this week, that said, quote, Laviska had more carries, 18, than receptions on targets traveling 7 or more yards downfield, 17, last year. That's a problem, but I don't necessarily think that's a capability thing. He was a really good prospect who did a lot in college. I think this is a usage thing, or how that coaching staff utilized Shenault during his rookie year. Because we've got this new staff, maybe we see him used in a different way. That's why I'm most intrigued by Shenault, because we've got a small sample on him. And a coaching staff change could be exactly what he needs to elevate his game in both fantasy and real football. But I'll be honest, I'm not incredibly high on any of them. Not that I have to, given their ADP. The last question this week is from @NTabs33. I'm interested to know your perspective on content creation within the fantasy industry. What advice do you have for someone starting out? Tips, tricks, follow suggestions? So I don't think I have all the answers on this topic, but I get people asking me this question pretty frequently. So I figured that I'd talk about it to close out today's show. I think your goal overall is very important here. If you're someone with a good day job and you like your day job and you just want to write some content and analyze the game as a hobby, that's one thing. Do what you want to do because it's a hobby. If you're really trying to make it a job, that's different. In that case, straight up, like anything that you do that you want to get compensated for, you've got to stand out. What makes your analysis better than other analysis that's out there? But more importantly, why would it get noticed? Too often we see people writing pretty generic fantasy articles. Like if you're trying to stand out, writing an article on why CeeDee Lamb is a good pick this year, that's not going to get you very far. Just to be honest. It could be a great article, it could be really well thought out, but it's a pretty bland topic. A lot of people are writing about that and they're saying the exact same thing. Instead, if you look around the fantasy industry, the people who are doing it full time are typically ones who are able to capture that macro level and come forward with some pretty unique content. And then once you're noticed, then you can dig into that player analysis because more people are going to listen to you because you have that backbone. Find your point of differentiation. Find what makes you unique. It can be a certain piece of analysis, similar to what Matt Harmon did with reception perception. It could be a unique way of presenting that content. I don't know what that thing is for you or for anyone else. But I would spend time surveying the landscape, seeing what's missing, and try to build something and do something to fill that gap. I really think the concept here is that simple, because good content in this space generally ends up being found in some way. It's just finding what that topic is or what your point of differentiation is. That's a really tough thing to do because it takes more than just being a good analyst to do that a lot of times. But differentiation is everything in most industries. That's no different in the fantasy one. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you enjoy your weekend.